Good evening and welcome. Tonight we are going to be reading some articles from my issues of History magazine, and this month's theme is going to be famous queens. So of course we're looking at Nefertiti and Catherine the Great, and we're also going to look at stories about queens from the Old Testament. Now, these articles were actually chosen not by me, but by my channel members. The members this month were, there was a lot of them. There was Fear, Pamela, Nebulous Wisp, LaDonna, and DR. All chose these articles for the month. So thank you to all of you who selected articles, and if you would like to pick articles for next month's History magazine video, you can click the join button right down there. It's only 99 US cents a month. I've made it as cheap as possible so that as many people can join without worrying about it costing too much money. So with that being said, let's get into the magazines. I think we will go chronologically, and we'll start with Nefertiti, iconic queen of Egypt. There we go. Nefertiti. It says artistic icon, enduring enigma. My lights are flickering. Okay, that's fun. The leading woman of all the nobles, great in the palace, perfect of appearance, beautiful in the double plume, the mistress of joy who is united with favor, whose voice people rejoice to hear, great wife of the king, his beloved, the great mistress of the two lands, Nefertiti, granted life forever and for eternity. Engraved on a stela found at Amarna, Egypt, this glowing passage describes Nefertiti, the great royal wife of Amenhotep IV, better known by the name he adopted later in life, Akhenaten. Her husband radically changed Egypt, transforming its polytheistic state religion to the worship of one deity, the solar disk Aten. He also moved the Egyptian capital to a new city he built named Akhetaten, meaning horizon of the god Aten. Akhenaten's revolution was short-lived. Egypt would return to its old faith after his reign. His successors tried to erase his name and legacy. His capital was abandoned, and artworks featuring his likeness and name and that of his family, including Nefertiti, were defaced. Their legacy would stay buried for millennia. Although the description of Queen Nefertiti is no doubt embellished, the claim that she was beautiful, perfect of appearance, seems to be borne out by the depictions of her that have survived to today. One work of art in particular has become emblematic of female beauty. After more than 3 millennia in obscurity, its discovery in the early 20th century brought Nefertiti world renown. Famous face. Nefertiti's glory resurfaced on December 6, 1912, when German archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt discovered her now iconic bust among the ruins at Amarna. Considered the most stunning depiction of a woman from the ancient world, and perhaps the most famous relic of antiquity, the bust seems the material embodiment of the Queen's name, which means the beautiful one has come. Borchardt discovered the bust while excavating inside the workshop of a court sculptor. The masterpiece had been extraordinarily well preserved during its 3,000-year burial. As Borchardt wrote in his excavation diary, colors as if paint was just applied, work absolutely exceptional, description is useless, must be seen. The high cheekbones, slender neck, and the vivid expression of a woman who seems almost to live and breathe has become an icon of beauty and Egyptian artistry. There's a cool picture down here of when they found it. We'll look at all the other pictures later after we read this. Despite the discovery of the Amarna bust in 1912, Nefertiti's name is barely mentioned in many histories of Egypt written by 20th century Western scholars such as Arthur Weigel and Will Durant. For many of their contemporaries, Akhenaten's sweeping religious and political reform takes center stage, while Nefertiti plays a supportive role of the beautiful great royal wife and mother. Recent scholarship is revealing her role to be far more complex, involving her in affairs of state, especially in establishing the monotheistic worship of Aten. Who was Nefertiti? Detailed documentation of Nefertiti's life is fragmented at best. Both the dates of her birth and death are unknown. Historians have been able to establish that Nefertiti was raised in the Egyptian royal court of unheralded parentage. She lived a privileged life as a child, surrounded by the splendor and ritual of Pharaoh Amenhotep III's long reign. Egypt was wealthy and secure during his rule. She married the heir to the throne in her teens, although some believe she may have been younger. Amenhotep IV succeeded his father sometime in his mid-20s or early 30s. During the 4th year of his reign, Nefertiti became his great royal wife. Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten, he who was beneficial to the Aten, sometime after the 5th year of his reign. Nefertiti enjoyed status and visibility unlike any woman in Egyptian history had enjoyed, including her images in art, in statuary, and on buildings. Above all, she became what Egyptologist Karakuni calls his chief priestess and ideological muse. As part of the religious shift, she received a new name as well, Neferuaten Nefertiti, which means the beauty of the beautiful ones of the Aten, the beauty has come. To make his new religion succeed, Akhenaten needed Nefertiti. She was elevated as co-equal in status in the worship of Aten, the sun god, granted honors greater than any Egyptian queen before her, and even given her own temple. The first of their daughters, Meritaten, was born early in the marriage and would be followed by 5 sisters. Their children were popular subjects with the court artists, for they were the corporeal manifestations of their sacred union, blessed by the sun god Aten that Egypt would come to worship exclusively. In works of art depicting the royal family together, the solar disk of Aten shines its rays down upon them all. There's a picture over here you can see. There's the sun, their rays. There's the pharaoh. There's Nefertiti and their daughters. The partnership of Akhenaten and Nefertiti heralded a series of great changes that their rule brought to Egypt, including the relocation of the capital city. The previous one was Thebes, which is now Luxor, a city closely linked to the ancient polytheistic divinities. In a bid to escape the old order, Akhenaten moved to virgin territory some 250 miles north on the eastern bank of the Nile in Middle Egypt. There he erected his completely new capital, Akhetaten, now known as Amarna, as the center of his mold-breaking monotheism, evolving canons of beauty. The artwork from the so-called Amarna period revealed the importance of Nefertiti in her husband's reign. Amarna's impact was revolutionary. During this brief time, the classical canons of art were torn up and replaced. Before the Amarna period, both male and female figures tended to be highly stylized, depicted by a rigid set of standards that were thousands of years old. people, both men and women, were slim and streamlined, rendered in a flat, two-dimensional style with face and body in profile and eyes and shoulders facing front. This canon of beauty changed dramatically when Nefertiti reigned. Lines that were previously rigid and straight became fluid, curved, and more natural. Both Akhenaten and Nefertiti were drawn using more sinuous curves. Both had luscious lips, long faces and noses, elongated bodies, protruding bellies, and wide hips. In the Amarna style, both male and female figures were rendered similarly, with both male and female traits. Scholars believe this emphasized Aten as being both father and mother to the Egyptian people. The pharaoh, like Aten, needed to embody both parental roles to create an indissoluble unity that would give blessings to Egypt. Artists seemed to delight in creating family portraits of the royal parents and their children, showing them in both moments of happiness and grief. The fullness of their lives is shown, providing an intimate look at the royal family. The shift in artistic style happened fast, and the rapid pace is linked to Akhenaten's desire for change. Within the context of Egyptian art, representations conveyed a message. When Akhenaten and Nefertiti introduced the worship of a sole god, they used art to preach their new ideology. Art became a tool to underline radical reforms. All previous aesthetic canons had to be eliminated for this new beginning. With the new cult of Aten established, Egyptian art abruptly looked different, the rigid forms of the past giving way to a more fluid aesthetic. The sculptor Thutmose then began producing unparalleled masterpieces in his Amarna workshop, with Nefertiti as one of his popular subjects. Although Egyptian art was changing, its ideals remained the same. A headless red quartzite sculpture in the Louvre Museum, Paris, encapsulates these ideals. It represents a young woman wearing a linen garment, showing her high, narrow waist, purred breasts, and rounded lower body. The model's identity is unknown. It may be Nefertiti herself or one of her daughters, but this ideal image is altogether new, an icon for Aten. And here's the statue, which, when you look at it, you don't really think Egypt. It looks almost more like Roman style, right? I love the fabric against, it looks so natural, doesn't it? Really beautiful. The Queen's Fate. While Nefertiti's family appeared to live in harmony, Egyptian culture, religion, politics, and economy were greatly disrupted, a marked shift from the stability of Akhenaten's father. In 1349 BCE, building a new city far away was a Herculean and extremely expensive task, and establishing this new capital threw all of Egypt into disarray. The new religion unsettled an entire culture based on polytheism, with an extensive network of priests, temples, and worshippers. The cost in taxes and to the Egyptian treasury was enormous. Thousands of Egyptians, many of them children, were forced into building Aten's new city, monuments, and temples. Meanwhile, the peace and prosperity of Egypt was waning. Rumbling threats from foreign lands meant that the people needed protection. Egypt, in arguably the wealthiest era in its history, went broke through extravagant spending on the new city, the new religion, and their support system during Akhenaten's rule. Akhenaten and Nefertiti ruled for about 17 years, and the pharaoh's reign ended with his death around age 40. Egypt would eventually return to its old ways, and Akhenaten would be written out of pharaonic history in Egypt. His monuments and statues were destroyed or dismantled. Worship of Aten ceased, and polytheism was restored as taxation returned to uphold the ancient and previously lucrative traditions. Perhaps above all, the Egyptian capital returned to Thebes. Akhenaten's new capital was abandoned, and it languished in ruined obscurity for more than 3,000 years. Nefertiti's life after the death of her husband is a subject of great debate among Egyptologists. They agree that she did outlive her husband, but the nature of her role in this time of volcanic change in Egyptian history is undetermined. Perhaps she faded away, or she could have taken on a more prominent role. Some 21st century scholars believe that about 5 years before his death, Akhenaten elevated his great royal wife to co-king and gave her a new name, Ankheperure Neferneferuaten. According to this theory, after Akhenaten died, Nefertiti took the throne, ruling under the name Ankheperure Smenkhkare, and guiding her country into the reign of the next male pharaoh, her stepson Tutankhamun. Cooney writes, Nefertiti would receive no credit for this political leadership, even though it was she who started the restoration of a country turned upside down. Nefertiti's final resting place has yet to be found. The boundary stele of Akhenaten, a group of royal monument inscriptions, indicates that she was to be buried in the royal tomb of Akhenaten in Amarna, but her tomb is not there. Scholars have begun looking in the Valley of the Kings and even in the tomb of her stepson. Non-invasive radar scans within Tutankhamun's tomb have detected anomalies, and some speculate these spaces could be Nefertiti's final resting place. Recent searches have found no evidence, but the search continues. Nefertiti's timeless allure is sustained by much more than her physical beauty. The 1912 discovery of the Amarna bust helped spark interest in her, but only more recently have Egyptologists focused on a fuller understanding of her life, including examination of her roles as co-pharaoh and regent. Speculation about her influence in restoring polytheism, financial and political stability, and cultural traditions to Egypt after Akhenaten's death has never been more intense. Archaeologists are on the hunt for her tomb, and new technologies and heightened interest worldwide make it more likely than ever that it will be found at last. There are so many more questions to be answered about the enduring enigma that was Nefertiti. So here's another really interesting statue in that Amarna style. There you go. Of Nefertiti. There's pictures here of some busts of her, including the very famous one that I believe is in the Egyptian Museum in Berlin. That one's really cool. And what else was there? Here they're looking in King Tut's tomb, trying to scan, see if there's anything hidden in there. And what was this other picture? This is Akhenaten's tomb. Very dark and spooky. You can see the very fainted drawings on the walls. Very cool. Let's skip ahead in history a bit, and we're going to talk about the times during the Old Testament. Let's see. Here we go. Queens of the Old Testament. You can see this beautiful painting here of Esther. Beginning with Eve, Hebrew scriptures and the books of the Old Testament provide key insights into ancient attitudes toward the role of women. Wives, mothers, sisters, daughters, and leaders, Sarah, Hagar, Rachel, Leah, and Deborah, are important figures in the journey of the Hebrew tribes that culminates in their people's settlement in Canaan, which are the modern-day Israel and Palestinian territories. Sorry if you can hear that noise in the background. I'm probably getting a text or something. The women who come after them, when their people unite, divide, and are exiled, have high-profile roles and stories about their struggles as a people. As queens and leaders, these female figures take on larger symbolic meanings, whether as role models, dire warnings, or bastions of hope. Queen of Israel. Bathsheba, wife to one king and mother of another, is queen during a golden age, the kingdom of David. After Moses leads the descendants of Abraham out of captivity in Egypt, he makes a covenant with God and agrees to follow his commandments. In return, the Hebrews will be given the land of Canaan. After facing a barrage of threats, they settle there and eventually unite under a king named Saul, whom tradition places around 1020 BCE. Under him, Israel becomes powerful, creating a conundrum. With kingship comes not only power, but also corruption. David becomes king after Saul. He is an inspirational leader, but is also easily tempted by lust and vanity. Bathsheba is a noble's daughter, with whom King David becomes captivated after spying on her while she bathes. Despite the fact that she is married to the soldier Uriah, he seduces her and she becomes pregnant. Hoping for his death, David sends Uriah to fight on the front line, where he is killed in battle. The Old Testament gives no insight into Bathsheba's feelings. She appears to have little say in the matter. After her husband's death, Bathsheba weds David and becomes queen. The text is quite clear on Yahweh's view on David's actions. Yahweh, through the prophet Nathan, condemns David's sinful behavior and punishes him. The pair's first child, conceived during their adulterous affair, will not survive. Nathan said to David, "You shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child that is born to you shall die." Divine punishment may be directed at David, but Bathsheba will suffer as well. After they are married, David and Bathsheba have a second child, a son named Solomon. To secure his power, David takes other wives, including daughters from each of the 12 tribes of Israel and some from foreign allies. David's children with them will compete with Bathsheba's son for the throne. Adoniah, son of Haggith, is David's oldest living son and has priority in the line of succession. When David is on his deathbed, the prophet Nathan learns that Adoniah is already proclaiming himself king. At Nathan's urging, Bathsheba approaches her ailing husband to secure succession for Solomon. She succeeds and obtains the throne of Israel for her son. Queens of idolatry. King Solomon's reign was celebrated for his wisdom and for his ambitious building campaigns, including constructing the temple in Jerusalem. No sooner had Solomon died than the Jewish kingdom separated into two, Israel in the north and Judah in the south, centered on Jerusalem. King Omri, who ruled the northern kingdom of Israel in the early 9th century BCE, has been attested to by Assyrian sources. He was a powerful regional figure but did not outlaw worship of other gods. Omri allowed the worship of Baal, a Canaanite storm god, alongside the worship of Yahweh. The Old Testament books of Kings downplay the successes of Omri's dynasty in economic and international affairs, and condemn the fact that many of Israel's rulers did not prohibit Canaanite cults. Two queens from the house of Omri are perhaps best remembered for the divine punishment brought down on them. Their names are Jezebel and her daughter Athaliah. A Phoenician princess and not an adherent of the Hebrew faith, Jezebel becomes the wife of Omri's son and successor, King Ahab, who reigned in the northern kingdom of Israel circa 874 BCE. I hope I'm getting all the names right. I hope so. If not, just let me know in the comments. As Queen Jezebel took part in affairs of state, including acquiring land for the crown. Ahab wants to buy a vineyard adjacent to his palace, but the owner, Naboth, refuses to sell. The vineyard is part of the family inheritance, and Israelite law prohibits its sale outside the family. The king is disgruntled. Jezebel hatches a plan, telling her husband, "Do you now govern Israel? Get up, eat some food, and be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth." Jezebel writes letters under her husband's seal and invites Naboth to a banquet, where she instructs two of her men to accuse him of blasphemy. A trial ensues. Naboth is convicted, and he is stoned to death. Ahab secures the vineyard, but the episode is used to show how the northern kingdom has lost its way. Its king allows himself to be led astray by his foreign wife. The Old Testament authors condemn Jezebel's religious influence most of all. She supports the cult of Baal, which sparks the wrath of the prophet Elijah. The prophet publicly challenges the priests of Baal to bring forth rain and lightning from their god. After they fail, Elijah's appeals to Yahweh successfully summon up a deluge, and the prophet orders the execution of the priests of Baal. When Jezebel learns of Elijah's actions, she threatens his life. He flees into exile. Before he goes, Elijah delivers one last prophecy to Ahab and Jezebel. "Because you have sold yourself to do what is evil in the sight of the Lord, I will bring disaster on you." Ahab dies shortly after in battle. Ahab and Jezebel's son, Jehoram, succeeds to the throne of Israel, but is defeated by a military commander, Jehu. After killing Jehoram, Jehu travels to the city of Jezreel to face Jezebel. The queen is trapped in a tower and then thrown from a window to her death. Jehu's defeat of Jehoram is believed to be supported by one of biblical archaeology's greatest treasures, the Tel Dan Stela. Discovered in 1993 in northern Israel, Aramaic inscriptions on the 9th century BCE fragments commemorate a king's victory over a king in Israel and a king of the house of David. Again, sorry for the staticky noises. I have no idea how that's happening. The stela is the first archaeological mention of the house of David, making it a significant find. No fragments bearing the names of the specific kings have been found, but scholars believe the defeated king of Israel is Jezebel's son Jehoram. Jezebel's legacy is perpetuated by her daughter Athaliah. In an attempt to build bridges between the divided northern and southern kingdoms, Athaliah marries the king of Judah, named Jehoram like her brother, and rules as queen. Their son Ahaziah, inherits the throne but is assassinated. Following her son's death, Athaliah then massacres all possible aspirants to the throne of Judah and seizes power herself. Only her grandson Jehoash escapes by being hidden away. He is raised by the priest Jehoiada, that's a cool name, who later launches a revolt against the queen. Athaliah is the only woman to exercise power as Queen of Judah in her own right. Like her Phoenician mother, she followed the Canaanite cult of Baal, although she did not suppress worship of Yahweh. Her support of the cult earned her the ire of the Hebrew priest and his followers. Scholars believe that the priest led an insurrection against Queen Athaliah in the later part of the 9th century BCE. Jehoash was crowned in the temple in the presence of his grandmother before she was executed on the palace grounds. After her death, the people destroy the temple of Baal and kill one of his priests. I'm going to try to move my mic away from my phone that's recording, maybe so it picks up less things. Let's see how that comes out. The stories of Jezebel and Athaliah serve as cautionary tales. The women's most grievous sin is not ambition, but their failure to exclusively worship Yahweh. Their support for the cult of Baal turns them into objects of scorn. The Savior Queen. During the century that followed Jezebel and Athaliah, the threat to the northern and southern kingdoms came from the outside. The kingdom of Israel was overrun by the Assyrians in the 8th century BCE. Then came Judah's turn in the early 7th century BCE, when Sennacherib besieged Jerusalem. The second book of Kings recounts how God sends an avenging angel to slay his army, and Jerusalem is saved. By 600 BCE, the Assyrians had been defeated by a regional power centered on Babylon. This new power would soon turn its attention to Judah and conquer it. Jerusalem was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar II in 586 BCE, and the elite of Judah were exiled to Babylon. Rather than destroying Hebrew identity, the exile helped shape many central tenets of Judaism. The compilation of the Jewish national story arose from having to sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land. Scholars believe that the Book of Kings and other books of the Old Testament were compiled during the exile to make sense of the trauma that had befallen them. In 538 BCE, the Persian ruler of Babylonia, Cyrus the Great, allowed the Jews to return to Judah. Many, however, stayed in Babylon, and it is from this community that the story of Esther comes, told in the biblical book that bears her name. Esther's beauty and wit attracts the Persian king Ahasuerus, possibly King Xerxes I, although scholars have not conclusively associated Ahasuerus with a specific king, and she becomes his queen. She hides her Jewish heritage from her husband. Meanwhile, Esther's cousin Mordecai, a court official, learns of a plot against the king and thwarts it. He incites the jealousy of the vizier, Haman, who presents false charges against the Jews and convinces the king to kill all the Jews in Persia. To save his people, Mordecai persuades Esther to intercede. Risking her life, Esther reveals that she is Jewish and asks him to save her people. Realizing that Haman has been disloyal and dishonest, the king orders him to be hanged on the very gallows Haman had prepared for Mordecai, and then makes Mordecai his new vizier. King Ahasuerus then decrees that Jews in the empire may defend themselves from anyone trying to carry out Haman's orders on the 13th day of the month of Adar, the day Haman selected to kill them. Scholars believe the book of Esther was written perhaps as late as the 2nd century BCE, much later than other Old Testament books. When compared to other stories, its difference is striking, as Esther acts independently without any direct divine intervention. She is guided by her own courage and wisdom. Esther and her courage inspires joy and is the focus of the Jewish celebration of Purim. Every year she is remembered as the resourceful queen who saved her people. Bathsheba, Jezebel, Atalia, and Esther are all associated with different eras of Jewish history, from a golden age during the kingdom of David to the turmoil of a kingdom split by internal tensions and facing foreign threats, to the potential dangers of being Jewish in the diaspora. The tales of these women served to remind the Jewish people of their covenant with Yahweh, the dangers that came with breaking it, and the duty they had to each other and the wider world. It's a really cool painting here of Esther, but you can definitely tell it was made in a certain era, because there's no way they would have worn this style of clothes back then. And then last, here's another really beautiful painting of Esther, looking probably much more like how she would have looked back then in these beautiful clothes. Very nice. All right, let me move the mic one more time before we go to Catherine. Hopefully all those little staticky noises are done. I don't know, sometimes when I get, because I'm filming on my phone, right? Sometimes when I get a text on my phone, my microphone picks it up. I don't know. I'll find out after, apparently. Let's find Catherine the Great. There it is. Catherine II of Russia becoming the Great. There she is. Okay, let me adjust this one more time. You guys can't tell what I'm doing, but maybe the sound makes a difference. I don't know. Anyway, okay, now my upstairs neighbors are talking really loudly. You probably can't hear it, but it's really distracting to me. Fun times. Anyway, here we go. In 1729, a baby girl was born to fading Prussian nobility in the bleak garrison town of Stettin, Germany, which today is in Poland. Her childhood was lacking in parental love, but rich in education and social striving. At 14, she was summoned to Russia to change her name, religion, and language to marry a future czar. In the end, however, it was Russia that would be transformed by her. Sophia Frederica Augusta was raised on the fringes of power in the Prussian Empire. Her mother, Johanna, was a master at exploiting social and family connections, while her father, Prince Christian Augustus of Anhalt-Zerbst, had a name more impressive than his quiet, frugal self. Their mismatched marriage was an unhappy one, and a daughter was unlikely to raise the family fortunes. Years later, in what would become some 700 pages of lively, frank, and self-justifying memoirs and letters, the Russian Empress would write of her entry into the world. I was not very joyfully welcomed. Her excellent education had one purpose: to marry well. It included lessons in everything from proper curtsying to philosophy and French, the lingua franca of Europe's elite. She challenged her teachers, especially on matters of faith over logic. When her Lutheran tutor threatened the cane, it taught her only that brains were more persuasive than brawn. I am convinced in my inmost soul that Herr Wagner was a blockhead, she wrote. All my life I have had this inclination to yield only to gentleness and reason, and to restrict all pressure. Although anxious over this devil of pride in her daughter, Johanna nonetheless brought Sophie on her travels to northern German courts. It was part of an early campaign to arrange a marriage for the girl, who, while plain in appearance, had an abundance of charm. On one court visit in 1739, at age 10, Sophie met her recently orphaned second cousin, Karl Peter Ulrich, the only surviving grandson of Tsar Peter I, better known as Peter the Great. Attuned to the whisperings of court gossip, Sophie overheard that the child duke was hot-headed, and, though just 11, inclined to drink. Young Peter was physically abused by his primary tutor and often left hungry as punishment. He found solace in toy soldiers and playing the violin, poorly. No one seemed to take his education seriously. His most conscientious teacher, she would poignantly recall for future husband's troubled early life, was the ballet master, Landais, who taught him to dance. A few years later, it would be this ill-prepared and abused boy whom the childless Russian Empress Elizabeth, searching for a legitimate Romanov heir, would pluck away from Prussia. Thanks to family ties with Johanna, Empress Elizabeth would next turn her matchmaking eyes to his former court playmate, the socially astute and well-educated Sophie. Perhaps it seemed a good match. The pairing was doomed. Building a family. Summoned to Russia, the 14-year-old bride-to-be treated the young duke as her master and worked to please the empress. Sophie took the Russian name Catherine, or Ekaterina, converted from Lutheranism to Russian Orthodoxy, and spent long nights pacing barefoot on cold floors, memorizing Russian words. Her efforts resulted not only in pneumonia, but also in a glowing reputation as a devotee of her new homeland. Her image was further boosted when, gravely ill, she waved off a Lutheran priest in favor of an Orthodox one. Her relationship with the childlike Peter evolved, but it was mostly for the worse. Of their unromantic wedding night in 1745, she wrote, "He went to sleep, and this went on for 9 years. To pass the time, she played blind man's buff, whist, and faro with her ladies-in-waiting. She became an accomplished equestrian, using her long skirts to disguise when she was not riding side saddle. Peter played with his toy soldiers or would scrape on his violin, which, she wrote, tortured my eardrums from morning to night." The unhappy couple did everything but secure the Romanov lineage with an heir. Empress Elizabeth was getting frustrated. Soon enough, Catherine was advised by her chief lady-in-waiting that in times of major consequence, there were exceptions to the rules of fidelity, and she could choose between SS and LN without intervention. Both are gentlemen-in-waiting to Peter. Lev Narishkin was passed over for Sergei Saltykov, a rakish 26-year-old, and in 1754 a son was finally produced. Who exactly his father was remains a question. The Empress named the baby Paul and immediately separated him from Catherine, as she did a daughter born 3 years later. Both were unlikely progeny of Peter, who, according to Catherine, once said aloud, "God knows where my wife gets her pregnancies." Isolated from her children, constantly warned of her financial debts to the Empress, and appearing to lose her position in court, Catherine filled her days, then years, with reading. Philosophers such as Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Tacitus, she wrote, produced a revolution in my thinking. She asked to leave Russia, a request the Empress rejected. So she stayed, determined to hold her head high, and from then on let others, when in her presence, guess on which foot to dance. In 1762, the empress died of a stroke, and Peter gained the throne. His true loyalty to Prussia became painfully clear from reversing Russia's hard-won military gains against the Prussian Empire to forcing Russian officers into ill-fitting Prussian blue uniforms. The new Tsar began to talk of marrying another woman, questioned Paul's lineage, and publicly rebuked Catherine, calling her dura or fool, at a state banquet before briefly, drunkenly ordering her arrest. Catherine had to think, and fast. It was a question of perishing with him or by him, or else of saving myself, my children, and perhaps the state from the disaster. That was Peter III. The last choice seemed to me the surest. That choice, removing him from power, was one that already had growing support. At 5 a.m. on June 28th, the Tsarina was rushed with the aid of a few dozen officers and supporters to St. Peter's Assumption Cathedral and declared Empress Catherine II. Crowds surged. More military gathered, offering her parts of their uniforms, proud Russian green, not Peter's Prussian blue, to wear on horseback at the head of what became a force of 14,000 marching toward the estate where Peter III was relaxing. He gave up without a fight. 8 days later, imprisoned on an estate, Ropsha, outside St. Petersburg, he was dead. Strangled and possibly poisoned. Some accounts say those who kissed him in his open casket left with swollen lips from a lingering toxin. The official cause of Peter III's death was ignominious, a severe attack of hemorrhoidal colic. His murder would never be directly linked to Catherine, but his diagnosis became a snide euphemism for assassination. Enlightened despot. Neither Romanov nor Russian, Catherine suddenly had supreme power over 20 million people. Her 34-year reign, the longest of any female leader of Russia, would be guided by her desire to finish what Peter the Great had started: modernization, westernization, and expansion into the largest empire on earth. Little was overlooked on Catherine's imperial to-do list. Waking as early as 5 each morning, she moved quickly to appease Russia's nobility and reassure Europe with messages of peace and tolerance. Guided by Enlightenment principles, she wanted to be a despot, but a benevolent one, enlightened by reason over dogma, tyranny, or revenge. Those who helped her seize power were lavishly rewarded, former opponents pardoned. You only did your duty, she assured one who had urged Peter III to rise against her. She asked for open dialogue. I am very fond of the truth, she wrote to one official. Argue with me without any danger if it leads to good results in affairs. When she found members of her own Senate uneducated about their vast nation, she furnished them with an atlas. Her social, health, and educational reforms included the creation of the country's first orphanage. She argued for the scientific but terrifying advancement of inoculation and became one of the first in Russia to be immunized against smallpox. Catherine expanded schools across the empire and set up Russia's first public educational institution for women, the Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens, fully aware that it was on the nobility that her fragile hold on power depended. There's the Winter Palace, right? Yeah, the Winter Palace. She became a self-admitted glutton for art, collecting across Europe. To house it all, she chose a wing off the Winter Palace that would grow into the world's largest museum after the Louvre. Visitors would be met by a plaque detailing humorous rules of etiquette. All ranks shall be left outside the doors, similarly hats, and particularly swords. And speak with moderation and not too loudly, so that others present might not have not an earache or headache. Let me try that again. Speak with moderation and not too loudly, so that others present have not an earache or headache. That was better. It was a haven for the intellectual informality she loved, and she named it her Hermitage. In 1763, their second year on the throne, she began what would become a lifelong correspondence with the French artist Voltaire and other Enlightenment philosophers. When the penniless Denis Diderot put his library up for sale, she bought it, but ordered that it stay with him. Letters of ideas and mutual flattery that flowed between her and Europe's most progressive thinkers were shared far and wide, advancing her publicity campaign at home and abroad. Would one ever have suspected 50 years ago that one day the Scythians, Russians, would so nobly recompense in Paris the virtue, science, and philosophy that are treated so shamefully among us? Voltaire's question must have pleased her. Reforms in Russia. Actually, this is... Okay, I was about to say, I wonder if that's Voltaire with her right there, but no, it's an astronomer. That's pretty cool. In 1765, Catherine embarked on her most ambitious project yet, one that would take her up to 3 hours each day and 2 years to write. Her nakaz, or instruction, was designed to be a guidebook for the reorganization of Russia's entire legal and administrative system, based heavily on the French philosopher Montesquieu's 1748 Spirit of the Laws. It supported humanitarian ideas of a free citizenry beholden to a clear set of laws, and it disavowed capital punishment and torture. It also attempted to raise the ever-troubling question of serfdom in Russia. Serfs who were bonded to the land and treated as possessions to be bought and sold made up half the empire's population. Serfdom was an institution Catherine considered intolerable, though she herself awarded serfs to her supporters. It was a system so entrenched that a noble's wealth was measured in the number of souls owned, not in land. In exchange for serfs, nobles had to serve the state, typically through military service. Once completed, her nakaz was bogged down by her own bureaucracy and heavily edited by her counselors. Only a fraction of her original work was published. Gone were sections allowing serfs to buy their freedom and limiting their servitude to 6 years. What was released was nonetheless progressive enough that it was translated across Europe and banned in France. Her effort also resulted in the first ever meeting of a representative National Assembly from all parts of her empire. The delegates were to freely discuss their region's needs, but they also chose to debate a proper title for Catherine in gratitude for gathering them. According to historian Robert Massey, the most popular titles were the Great and All-Wise Mother of the Fatherland. Catherine refused them all, but the Great did receive the most votes. 1 second. Okay. Blah, blah, blah. The debate also helped legitimize her rule, which had already seen threats. In 1764, disgruntled military officers tried to free a remaining Romanov with a claim to the throne, 24-year-old Ivan VI, imprisoned since birth by Empress Elizabeth. He was preemptively killed by his guards, claiming to be the Tsar Peter III himself and somehow still alive. A Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev led a massive peasant uprising against Catherine that lasted 2 years. It was finally crushed in 1775. Although she started her reign sending couriers to Europe with messages of peace, Catherine increasingly responded with force when she saw either a threat or an opportunity in the shifting geopolitical alliances around her. She would go on to annex Crimea from the Ottomans, partition Poland with the Prussians, and expand her empire by 200,000 square miles. She also knew when to avoid conflict, declining a formal request from King George III to send 20,000 Russian troops and 1,000 Cossack cavalry soldiers to quell a revolutionary war that appeared to be breaking out in Britain's American colonies. Her military campaigns are often spearheaded by a favorite, the official designation of the men who would be her lovers, collaborators, and intellectual confidants. One, Grigory Grigorievich Orlov, had made it possible for her to seize the throne. Another she would later appoint as the conveniently pliable King of Poland. The most powerful of all, and possibly married to her in secret, was Grigory Potemkin. He would reshape her empire's southern reaches and build up a Black Sea naval fleet, helping her fulfill yet another goal of Peter the Great's. There's a badass picture of her here on this horse. I like that she looks like a boss. Epitaph for an Empress. In 1789, after Catherine had been on the throne nearly 30 years, the violence of the French Revolution marked a drastic turning point in her love affair with the Enlightenment. Fearing revolution herself, she began to censor liberal writings, including a study on the suffering of the serfs, and even the works of her longtime friend Voltaire. Catherine had already learned that some of her ideals were easier to imagine than to execute. She explained as much to the philosopher Diderot, who visited her in Russia in 1773. In your plans for reform, you are forgetting the difference between our two positions. You work only on paper which accepts anything, is smooth and flexible, and offers no obstacles either to your imagination or your pen, while I, poor Empress, work on human skin, which is far more sensitive and touchy. In her final years, as she ruled her empire, she found comfort in playing on the floor with her grandchildren, mothering them in ways she was not allowed with her own children, and taking walks with her greyhounds. On November 5th, 1796, according to the historian Massey, she rose at 6, drank black coffee, and sat down to write. A few hours later, she was found unconscious, most likely having suffered a stroke. On November 6th, it was announced that the Empress was dead, and His Majesty Paul would take the throne. It was only after her death that she would be called the Great. In her lifetime, she had always opposed it, as she explained in a 1788 letter to the German-born diplomat Baron von Grimm. I beg you to no longer call me, nor to any longer give me the sobriquet of Catherine the Great, because, primo, I do not like any sobriquet. Secondo, my name is Catherine the Second, and tertio, I do not want anyone to say of me, as of Louis XV, that one finds him badly named. Fond of listing items in threes, she nonetheless added a fourth and final point for laughs. My height is neither great nor small. Her memoirs, which revealed the inner workings of court, Peter III's failures, and the possibility that Paul was illegitimate and perhaps not a Romanov, immediately became a state secret, suppressed for a century, then buried again after 1917 when the Bolsheviks set up their headquarters in her Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens and later killed the last of the Tsars. But in life, ever in control of her empire and her pen and partly in jest, she even wrote her own epitaph. Here lies Catherine II, born in Stettin in 1729. She arrived in Russia in 1744 to marry Peter III. At 14, she had 3 desires: to be loved by her husband, Empress Elizabeth, and his people. She omitted nothing to achieve this. She achieved so much more. In her style, one might argue, primo, she was a woman ahead of her time, so she shaped her era to accommodate herself. Secondo, she chose her battles wisely. Tertio, her lasting reforms in the end, may have been her greatest coup of all. And that's where we're going to end it tonight. That was a very chaotic read on my end, but we won't worry about it. Hopefully you guys are relaxed or sleeping and maybe learn some cool stuff about some famous queens in history. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational, and thank you so much for watching. Again, if you want to help pick the next articles from History Magazine, you can click the join button right down there and join my memberships and get exclusive videos and like custom emojis and little fun other things. Have a very good